The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the small, quiet town. It seemed like any other evening, with people going about their routines, walking their dogs, closing up shops, and settling in for the night. But for Maria Carter, it was just another day trying to live her life in peace. Maria was a 35-year-old black woman, strong in ways most people couldn't see. She used a wheelchair after a devastating car accident years ago, but she never let it define her. Her spirit was unbreakable, her wit sharp, and her resilience unmatched. She kept to herself mostly, spending her days working from home as a freelance graphic designer and her nights reading or enjoying her favorite true crime shows. But there was a side to Maria that no one in town knew about, a part of her life she had buried deep and kept hidden. Before her injury, she had served in the military, not just as a soldier, but as a highly trained operative in an elite special forces unit. Her missions were classified, her skills unmatched. She had been a ghost in the field, the kind of operative you never saw coming until it was too late. But that was a lifetime ago. Or so she thought. It was on this particular evening, as Maria wheeled herself down the quiet main street after picking up groceries, that her past and present collided in a way she never anticipated. She noticed them first from the corner of her eye, a group of young men loitering near the corner store. Their laughter was loud, their eyes cold. Maria had seen enough in her life to recognize trouble when it was brewing. She kept her head down, hoping to pass unnoticed. But it didn't work. "Hey, aren't you going to say hi?" one of them called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Maria paused for a moment, her heart sinking. She didn't want trouble, but she also knew ignoring them might only make things worse. "Evening," she said politely, her voice calm but firm. Her response only seemed to amuse them. The group, 5 in total, stepped closer, their movements deliberate. The leader, a tall man with a menacing grin, leaned in. "What's a woman like you doing out here alone? Shouldn't you be home safe?" Maria felt the familiar stirrings of adrenaline, her senses sharpening like they used to in the field. She forced herself to stay calm, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm just heading home," she said evenly. But they weren't going to let her go that easily. Another man snickered. "Home? Nah, you should stay and hang with us. We've got all night." Maria's hands tightened on the wheels of her chair, but she didn't move. She was calculating, assessing. The street was too empty. There was no one around to intervene, no one to call for help. She didn't have a phone within easy reach, and even if she did, it wouldn't matter. The leader crouched down to her level, his face inches from hers. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue," he sneered. Maria's eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, her mask slipped. There was something in her gaze, something cold, something deadly. It was a look she hadn't worn in years, but it came back to her as naturally as breathing. The man faltered, his grin faltering for just a second. But he quickly recovered, laughing it off and gesturing to his friends. "Look at her. She thinks she's tough." They didn't know. They didn't know that the woman they were trying to intimidate had faced far greater threats than them. They didn't know that beneath her calm demeanor lay a predator's instincts, honed over years of life and death situations. Maria took a deep breath, her mind racing. She didn't want this. She didn't want to go back to that part of herself. But as the gang began to close in, laughing and jeering, she realized she might not have a choice. And then it happened. One of them reached out, grabbing the back of her chair. It was a mistake they wouldn't have time to regret. Maria's body moved before her mind fully registered what was happening. In an instant, her hand shot up, grabbing the man's wrist with a grip so strong and precise it made him yelp in pain. The others froze, their laughter dying in their throats. "What the?" The leader started, but Maria was already in motion. Her wheelchair wasn't a limitation. It was a weapon, an extension of her. And in that moment, the quiet, unassuming woman they thought they could bully disappeared, replaced by someone else entirely. The most feared operative in Special Forces history was back. But they didn't know that yet. Not until it was too late. The The silence on the street was heavy, broken only by the sound of the young man's pained gasp as Maria's iron grip held his wrist. His friends stood frozen, their smirks vanishing as confusion flickered across their faces. The woman they'd pegged as an easy target had just shifted the atmosphere, and none of them could quite process what was happening. Maria didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, bore into the man who had dared touch her chair. Slowly, deliberately, she released his wrist, and he stumbled back, clutching it like she burned him. He looked at his friends, wide-eyed, searching for reassurance, but they were just as stunned as he was. "Let me pass," she said calmly, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the group hesitate. The leader recovered first, straightening up and forcing a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "What? You think you can scare us?" he said, stepping forward again. His tone was more defensive than threatening now, but Maria caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. She didn't reply, didn't flinch. She just waited, her hands resting lightly on the wheels of her chair. Her posture was relaxed, but everything about her radiated a quiet readiness, the kind that came from years of training. One of the other men, shorter and clearly less confident, shifted nervously. "Maybe we should just let her go," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. But the leader wasn't ready to back down. His pride was at stake now, and he couldn't let his friends, or this woman, see him fold. "She's nothing. Just trying to act tough," he said, his words more for himself than anyone else. Maria's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a smile exactly, but there was a flicker of something, amusement maybe, or perhaps just the memory of how many times she'd seen men like him try to puff themselves up before realizing that they were outmatched. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, sharpening her senses. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted to dredge up the part of herself she'd tried so hard to leave behind. But here it was, rising to the surface, as natural and inevitable as breathing. "Do you really want to do this?" she asked, her voice steady and calm. The leader hesitated, his bravado wavering. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, one of the others stepped forward, emboldened by his silence. "You're in a wheelchair," the man scoffed. "What are you going to do?" Maria's gaze shifted to him, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. She didn't answer, but the intensity of her stare was enough to make him falter. Behind her calm exterior, Maria's mind was working rapidly. She was calculating distances, angles, potential escape routes. She didn't want to escalate this, but if they forced her hand, she needed to be ready. What they didn't know, what no one in this sleepy little town knew, was that Maria Carter had been one of the most lethal operatives in the field. Her missions had taken her to some of the most dangerous places on the planet, and she had faced enemies far more ruthless and dangerous than this gang of small-town bullies. But that life was behind her now, or at least it was supposed to be. The memory of her last mission flashed in her mind, unbidden. The explosion, the chaos, the split-second decision that had saved her team but cost her the use of her legs. It was the kind of trade-off she'd accepted without hesitation at the time, but it had changed everything. After the injury, Maria had been honorably discharged and given a slew of medals that felt more like burdens than rewards. She'd retreated to this quiet town, hoping to rebuild a life for herself far away from the violence and danger that had defined her for so long. She had convinced herself that chapter was closed, that she could finally be someone else, someone normal. But as the gang closed in around her, Maria realized that the past wasn't so easily left behind. One of the men, emboldened by the leader's silence, lunged forward, reaching for her again. It was a mistake. Before he could lay a hand on her, Maria's arm shot out, grabbing his wrist and twisting it in a fluid motion. He yelped in pain, dropping to one knee as she applied just enough pressure to make her point without causing serious harm. "Don't," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a command. The others stepped back instinctively, their confidence crumbling. The leader's face was a mixture of shock and rage, but even he seemed unsure of what to do now. Maria released the man's wrist, and he scrambled back, clutching his arm and glaring at her. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Maria didn't answer. She didn't owe them an explanation. She turned her chair slightly, her gaze sweeping over the group one last time. "This is your chance to walk away," she said evenly. "Take it." For a long moment, no one moved. The gang exchanged nervous glances, their bravado eroding under the weight of her unwavering composure. Finally, the leader scowled, muttering something under his breath. "Come on," he snapped, turning away. The others hesitated, but eventually followed, casting uneasy glances over their shoulders as they retreated down the street. Maria waited until they were out of sight before letting out a slow breath. Her hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to fade, but she steadied them on the wheels of her chair. She didn't want to think about what had just happened, about how close she'd come to crossing a line she promised herself she'd never cross again. But as she turned her chair and continued down the street, a new thought began to creep in. They would be back. People like that didn't just let things go, especially when their pride was bruised. And the next time, they might not come alone. Maria had spent years trying to leave her past behind, to live a life of peace and normalcy. But it seemed the past wasn't done with her yet. And deep down, a part of her knew it was only a matter of time before she'd have to confront it head-on. Maria rolled into her small, cozy home, the familiar creak of the wooden floors beneath her wheels offering a strange kind of comfort. She set her grocery bag on the counter, her movements steady and practiced. But her mind was racing. The encounter with the gang replayed in her head like a film on loop, each detail sharpening with every repetition. She told herself she'd handled it, that they'd think twice before trying anything again. But the flicker of doubt lingered. She sat at her kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet space. Her fingers tapped absently on the smooth surface, a habit she'd picked up during long hours of waiting on missions. It was strange how muscle memory could betray you even years later, no matter how much she tried to leave it behind. Her body still carried the habits of a soldier. Across the table, a stack of photos caught her eye. They were old, worn at the edges, but they were all she had left of her time in the service. Her team, her brothers and sisters in arms, smiled back at her from the grainy prints. There was Carter, her best friend, and the closest thing she'd ever had to a sibling. And Ramirez, the team's strategist who could outthink anyone, even in the worst of situations. They were gone now, casualties of the life they'd chosen. Maria was the only one left, and sometimes she wondered if that was the cruelest twist of fate. She had survived, but at what cost? She shook her head, pushing the photos aside. This wasn't the time for nostalgia or grief. She needed to think, to prepare. The gang might let things go, but her instincts told her otherwise. And instincts like hers were rarely wrong. That night, Maria lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep eluding her. Her mind kept returning to the gang leader's face, the way his bravado had faltered when he realized she wasn't what she seemed. But it wasn't just him that bothered her. It was the look in the other's eyes, fear, confusion, and something darker. Resentment. When morning came, she decided she couldn't leave things to chance. After breakfast, she rolled into the small room at the back of her house, the one she rarely opened anymore. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of metal and leather. She flipped the light switch, and the room illuminated in muted tones. Weapons, carefully stored and maintained, lined one wall. The other held shelves of gear, survival packs, tactical vests, and tools she hadn't touched in years. It was her past, neatly organized and hidden away, but never truly forgotten. Maria wheeled herself to the center of the room, her eyes scanning the equipment. She didn't plan on using any of it, at least not yet. But knowing it was there, ready and waiting, gave her a sense of control she hadn't realized she needed. Outside, the town bustled with its usual rhythm. People greeted each other on the sidewalks, children played in the park, and shopkeepers set up displays in their windows. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by the world's chaos, but Maria knew better. Trouble had a way of finding even the quietest corners. Across town, in a dimly lit garage on the outskirts, the gang was regrouping. The leader, Marcus, paced back and forth, his jaw clenched tight. His wrist ached where Maria had gripped him, and his pride hurt even worse. What are we going to do about her? One of the others, a lanky man named Pete, asked nervously. Marcus stopped pacing and glared at him. We're not just going to let her get away with that, he snapped. Pete shifted uncomfortably. But she's not normal. You saw what she did. Exactly, Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. And that's why we can't let her think she's untouchable. People like her don't belong here, acting like they're better than us. The others murmured their agreement, though none of them looked entirely convinced. As Marcus plotted, Maria's instincts told her something was coming. She couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter wasn't over, that Marcus wasn't the type to let go of a grudge. She needed to stay vigilant. She spent the next few days keeping to her usual routine, but with heightened awareness. Her wheelchair moved a little faster through town, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. She avoided the places where she might run into trouble, but she knew avoidance would only work for so long. Late one evening, as she sat on her porch watching the stars, she heard a noise. A faint rustling coming from the edge of her yard. She froze, every muscle in her body going tense. It could have been the wind or an animal, but she wasn't taking any chances. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice firm. The rustling stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then a voice called back, low and uncertain. "It's me, Sarah." Maria relaxed slightly. Sarah was her neighbor, a teenager who often stopped by to chat or ask for advice. Maria had taken a liking to her. She was bright and curious, always asking about Maria's life and work, though Maria never revealed much. "What are you doing out here so late?" Maria asked as Sarah stepped into view. "I saw some guys hanging around the street earlier," Sarah said, her tone uneasy. "They didn't look like they were from around here. I thought I'd check to make sure you were okay." Maria's heart sank. She didn't need to ask who the men were. "Thanks, Sarah," Maria said, forcing a smile. "I'll be fine. You should head home before your parents start to worry." Sarah nodded but hesitated. "You sure you're okay? You've been acting different lately." "I'm fine," Maria assured her. "But thank you for looking out for me." As Sarah left, Maria's mind raced. If the gang was watching her, it was only a matter of time before they made their move. And when they did, she would need to be ready. The tension in the air was thick, the calm before the storm. Maria didn't know when or how it would come. But one thing was certain. She couldn't avoid the conflict any longer. The life she tried so hard to leave behind was catching up with her, and this time there was no running from it. Maria rolled into her small, cozy home, the familiar creak of the wooden floors beneath her wheels offering a strange kind of comfort. She set her grocery bag on the counter, her movements steady and practiced, but her mind was racing. The encounter with the gang replayed in her head like a film on loop, each detail sharpening with every repetition. She told herself she'd handled it, that they'd think twice before trying anything again. But the flicker of doubt lingered. She sat at her kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet space. Her fingers tapped absently on the smooth surface, a habit she'd picked up during long hours of waiting on missions. It was strange how muscle memory could betray you even years later. No matter how much she tried to leave it behind, her body still carried the habits of a soldier. Across the table, a stack of photos caught her eye. They were old, worn at the edges, but they were all she had left of her time in the service. Her team, her brothers and sisters in arms, smiled back at her from the grainy prints. There was Carter, her best friend. They were gone now, and the closest thing she'd casualties of the life they'd chosen. And Maria was the only one the team's strategist who could sometimes she wondered if that was the cruelest twist of situations. She had survived, but what cost? She shook her head, pushing the photos aside. This wasn't the time for nostalgia or grief. She needed to think, to prepare. The gang might let things go, but her instincts told her otherwise. and instincts like hers were rarely wrong. That night, Maria lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep eluding her. Her mind kept returning to the gang leader's face, the way his bravado had faltered when he realized she wasn't what she seemed. But it wasn't just him that bothered her. It was the look in the other's eyes, fear, confusion, and something darker. Resentment. When morning came, she decided she couldn't leave things to chance. After breakfast, she rolled into the small room at the back of her house, the one she rarely opened anymore. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of methyl and leather. She flipped the light switch, and the room illuminated in muted tones. Weapons, carefully stored and maintained, lined one wall. The other held shelves of gear, survival packs, tactical vests, and tools she hadn't touched in years. It was her past, neatly organized and hidden away, but never truly forgotten. Maria wheeled herself to the center of the room, her eyes scanning the equipment. She didn't plan on using any of it, at least not yet. But knowing it was there, ready and waiting, gave her a sense of control she hadn't realized she needed. Outside, the town bustled with its usual rhythm. People greeted each other on the sidewalks, children played in the park, and shopkeepers set up displays in their windows. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by the world's chaos, but Maria knew better. Trumbull had a way of finding even the quietest corners. Across town, in a dimly lit garage on the outskirts, the gang was regrouping. The leader, Marcus, paced back and forth, his jaw clenched tight. His wrist ached where Maria had gripped him, and his pride hurt even worse. "What are we going to do about her?" One of the others, a lanky man named Pete, asked nervously. Marcus stopped pacing and glared at him. "We're not just going to let her get away with that," he snapped. Pete shifted uncomfortably. "But she's not normal. You saw what she did." "Exactly," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "And that's why we can't let her think she's untouchable. People like her don't belong here, acting like they're better than us." The others murmured their agreement, though none of them looked entirely convinced. As Marcus plotted, Maria's instincts told her something was coming. She couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter wasn't over, that Marcus wasn't the type to let go of a grudge. She needed to stay vigilant. She spent the next few days keeping to her usual routine, but with heightened awareness. Her wheelchair moved a little faster through town, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. She avoided the places where she might run into trouble, but she knew avoidance would only work for so long. Late one evening, as she sat on her porch watching the stars, she heard a noise, a faint rustling coming from the edge of her yard. She froze, every muscle in her body going tense. It could have been the wind or an animal, but she wasn't taking any chances. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice firm. The rustling stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then a voice called back, low and uncertain. "It's me, Sarah." Maria relaxed slightly. Sarah was her neighbor, a teenager who often stopped by to chat or ask for advice. Maria had taken a liking to her. She was bright and curious, always asking about Maria's life and work, though Maria never revealed much. "What are you doing out here so late?" Maria asked as Sarah stepped into view. "I saw some guys hanging around the street earlier," Sarah said, her tone uneasy. "They didn't look like they were from around here. I thought I'd check to make sure you were okay." Maria's heart sank. She didn't need to ask who the men were. "Thanks, Sarah," Maria said, forcing a smile. "I'll be fine. You should head home before your parents start to worry." Sarah nodded but hesitated. "You sure you're okay? You've been acting different lately." "I'm fine," Maria assured her, "but thank you for looking out for me." As Sarah left, Maria's mind raced. If the gang was watching her, it was only a matter of time before they made their move, and when they did, she would need to be ready. The tension in the air was thick, the calm before the storm. Maria didn't know when or how it would come. But one thing was certain. She couldn't avoid the conflict any longer. The life she tried so hard to leave behind was catching up with her, and this time, There was no running from it. The nights in the small town had grown colder, the crisp air carrying with it a sense of unease that Maria couldn't shake. Days passed with no sign of Marcus or his crew, but the silence felt heavier than any confrontation. She knew this wasn't over. Men like Marcus didn't back down. They regrouped, rearmed, and came back when you least expected it. Maria had spent the past few days quietly preparing, running through scenarios in her head, the kind of strategic thinking that had once kept her alive in the field. She hadn't been sleeping well. Her mind was too restless, her body too on edge. Even in the solitude of her home, she felt the weight of their presence lurking just beyond the edges of her awareness. She checked the locks on her doors and windows one more time before rolling into the living room. Her home was modest but well kept, each piece of furniture placed with care. To the outside world, it was the home of a quiet woman who lived a simple life. But Marian knew the truth. It was also a fortress, a place she could defend if it came to that. The faint hum of the town at night had always been a comfort, but tonight it only amplified her nerves. She left the lights off, sitting in the dark with her eyes on the window, waiting for something, anything. It was a waiting game she knew too well. The sound came just after midnight. A faint creak of wood, too deliberate to be the wind. Maria's muscles tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the small drawer under the table where she kept her sidearm. There it was again, a shuffle, then a low whisper. They were trying to be quiet, but they weren't trained for this. Their movements were clumsy, their footsteps uneven. Maria had been trained to hear the sound of danger, and this was unmistakable. She stayed perfectly still listening. There were at least 3 of them, maybe 4. They were moving around the house, testing windows, trying to find a weak spot. Maria's mind raced. She could confront them now, catch them off guard, but something held her back. She needed to know what they were planning. A sharp clatter echoed from the back of the house. They'd found the window near the kitchen, her only real vulnerability. She heard the faint pop of the lock being forced, followed by the slow creak of the window sliding open. Her breath was steady, her grip firm on the handle of her weapon. She waited, counting the seconds in her head. The first man climbed in, his heavy boots hitting the floor with a dull thud. Another followed, their whispers barely audible as they coordinated. Maria stayed in the shadows, her body calm, but her mind razor sharp. She could hear them moving through the kitchen, their voices growing louder as their confidence grew. "See, she's not so tough," one of them muttered, his tone cocky. "Just grab what we came for and let's go," another hissed. Maria's jaw tightened. This wasn't about robbery. They weren't here for her belongings. They were here to make a statement, to prove something to themselves and their leader. She let them move further into the house before making her move. With practiced precision, she rolled silently into the hallway, her shadow bending into the darkness. The men hadn't noticed her yet, their focus on rummaging through the kitchen drawers. Looking for something, Maria's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The men froze, their heads snapping toward her. For a moment, no one moved. "Whoa!" one of them started, but he didn't get the chance to finish. The light from the hallway clicked on, illuminating Maria as she sat there, calm and composed, her weapon resting in her lap. Her presence was commanding, her expression unreadable. "You've got about 10 seconds to leave," she said evenly, her voice carrying the weight of authority. The men exchanged nervous glances. The leader of the group, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward, trying to mask his fear with bravado. "You don't scare us," he said, though his voice wavered. Maria tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his. "You should be scared," she said, her tone cold but steady. The scarred man hesitated, his confidence faltering under the weight of her words. One of the others, younger and visibly more nervous, took a step back, his hands shaking. "This is your only warning," Maria said, her voice firm. "Walk out of here now, and I won't call the cops. Stay, and you'll regret it." The scarred man's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, there was a commotion outside. Voices, loud and agitated, broke the tension. Marcus. Maria recognized his voice instantly. He was shouting orders, his tone sharp and commanding. She realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't just a small crew anymore. She glanced toward the front window and saw shadows moving across the porch. Marcus hadn't come alone. The men in the kitchen looked just as startled as she felt. "What's he doing here?" One of them whispered, his voice panicked. Maria's mind raced. This was worse than she'd anticipated. Marcus wasn't just here to settle a grudge. He was here to make a statement, to prove he was in control. The front door rattled as someone tried to force it open. Maria gripped the wheels of her chair, her heart pounding. She wasn't afraid. Fear wasn't something she allowed herself to feel anymore. But the stakes had just risen dramatically. She rolled back into the shadows, her mind already formulating a plan. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading, but also preparing for. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting to reclaim the peace she'd worked so hard to build. As the door gave way and Marcus stepped inside, flanked by more of his crew, Maria's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to hide. It was time to show them exactly who they were dealing with. As Marcus stepped into the house, the air seemed to grow heavier, thick with the tension of what was about to unfold. His footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor, each one deliberate, each one a warning. The men behind him were jittery, their movements lacking the discipline of their leader. Marcus, however, was calm. Too calm. It was the kind of calm Maria recognized from experience, the kind that came just before something dangerous. He scanned the room, his gaze sharp and calculating, until it landed on her. She remained in the shadows, her face partially obscured by the dim light. Her grip on the wheels of her chair was firm but subtle, her posture composed. If Marcus was hoping to intimidate her, he wasn't succeeding. "You've got guts," he said, his voice low and even. "I'll give you that." Maria didn't respond immediately. She let his words hang in the air, her silence more powerful than anything she could have said. Finally, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. "And you've got a habit of making poor decisions," she said, her tone razor sharp. A flicker of irritation crossed Marcus's face, but he quickly masked it. He motioned for his men to spread out, their heavy boots thudding against the floor as they moved through her home. They were searching for something, though Maria wasn't sure what. "Do you even know who you're dealing with?" Marcus asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Maria smirked, the kind of smirk that was more unsettling than any glare. "Funny," she said, her tone calm but cutting. "I was just about to ask you the same thing." Her response caught him off guard, but before he could reply, a sudden noise outside shattered the moment. The sound of tires screeching to a halt, followed by the slam of car doors, cut through the stillness. Marcus froze, his head snapping toward the window. The men around him exchanged nervous glances, their bravado faltering. "What now?" One of them muttered, his voice tinged with fear. Maria's heart raced, though her expression remained unreadable. She hadn't called for help. She didn't trust the local authorities to handle a situation like this. But someone else clearly had. Seconds later, there was a knock on the front door. Not a tentative knock, but a firm, deliberate one. Marcus motioned for one of his men to check it, his jaw clenched tight. The man opened the door cautiously, only to step back in surprise as a woman strode inside. She was tall, with an air of confidence that rivaled Maria's. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and her sharp eyes swept the room with practiced precision. Maria's breath caught. She hadn't seen this woman in years, but there was no mistaking her. It was Carter's sister, Naomi, a former intelligence operative who had disappeared off the grid after her brother's death. "Naomi," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. Naomi's gaze landed on her, a flicker of recognition. Marcus took a step forward, his confusion turning into suspicion. "Maria, who the hell are you?" Simply, her tone he demanded with both relief and determination. Naomi ignored him, her focus solely on Maria. "I heard you might need some backup," she said, a faint smirk playing at the corners of her lips. Maria didn't ask how Naomi had found her or why she'd shown up now, of all times. None of that mattered. What mattered was that she wasn't alone anymore. Marcus, however, wasn't about to back down. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, his voice rising, "but this doesn't concern you." Naomi turned to him, her expression cold and unyielding. "You're wrong," she said. "Anything that concerns Maria concerns me." The room grew even tenser, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. Marcus's men shifted uneasily, clearly unsure of how to proceed. And then, just when it seemed like the standoff couldn't escalate any further, another sound broke the silence. A distant rumble, growing louder with each passing second. Maria's eyes narrowed. She recognized that sound. It was the unmistakable roar of motorcycles, and it was getting closer. Marcus seemed to realize it too, his bravado slipping as he turned toward the door. "What the hell is going on?" he hissed. Naomi exchanged a glance with Maria, her expression grim but resolute. "Looks like the cavalry's here," she said quietly. The motorcycles screeched to a stop outside, their engines cutting off one by one. The front yard was suddenly alive with movement, shadows flickering in the faint light from the porch. Marcus's men crowded around him, their earlier confidence now replaced with uncertainty. Whatever reinforcements he might have been expecting, this wasn't it. Maria rolled forward slightly, her eyes locked on Marcus. "You came here to prove something," she said, her voice steady. "Now's your chance." Marcus glared at her, but the fear in his eyes was impossible to hide. He was out of his depth, and he knew it. The front door creaked open again, and a man stepped inside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent in hard, unforgiving environments. His presence was commanding, his gaze sharp as it swept the room. Maria felt a surge of both relief and trepidation. It was Ramirez, her old team strategist, thought to be dead along with the rest of her unit. "Maria," he said, his voice calm but firm, "looks like you've been busy." She couldn't find the words to respond. Ramirez's sudden appearance was a twist she hadn't anticipated, and it raised more questions than it answered. Marcus, meanwhile, looked like he was about to lose it. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling, his grip on the situation slipping away. Maria didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. The stakes had just been raised, and the game was far from over. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation as Ramirez stepped further into the house. His calm demeanor was unnerving, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing inside. Maria's mind raced, trying to piece together how Ramirez and Naomi had found her, why they had come now, and what it all meant. But there was no time for questions. Marcus' crew was growing restless, their uncertainty fueling their fear, and Maria could feel the moment teetering on the edge of violence. Marcus straightened, his bravado faltering but not yet gone. "I don't know who you people think you are," he said, his voice cracking slightly despite his attempt to sound in control. "But you're in my way, and that's a mistake." Ramirez chuckled softly, a sound that was more unsettling than reassuring. "No, Marcus," he said, his voice steady. "The mistake is thinking you could come after Maria and walk away." The door swung open again, and the sound of boots echoed as a small group of Ramirez people entered. They were nondescript, dressed in plain clothes, but their movements were precise, their eyes sharp. These weren't ordinary civilians. They were trained, like Ramirez, like Maria. Marcus's crew shifted uneasily, their confidence now fully replaced with fear. Even Marcus himself seemed to shrink under the weight of what he was up against. Maria rolled forward slightly, positioning herself in the center of the room. Her voice was calm, but carried a weight that made everyone stop. "You came here thinking I was an easy target," she said, her eyes locked on Marcus. "You thought my wheelchair made me weak, but what you don't understand is that I spent my entire life fighting battles you can't even imagine. And I didn't survive all that to be taken down by you." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Naomi stepped forward. "You've already lost," she said, her tone sharp. "The tension in the only choice you have now is how this ends. Every second stretching away into an eternity, or deal with us." Then, with a shaky breath, one of Marcus's men dropped his weapon to the floor. The sound was like a signal. Another followed, then another, until all of Marcus's crew had surrendered. But Marcus wasn't ready to give up. His hand moved toward his waistband, and Maria's instincts kicked in. "Don't," she warned, her voice cutting through the chaos. He hesitated, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. In one swift motion, he drew his weapon. But before he could raise it, Naomi was there, disarming him with a speed and precision that left him stunned. The gun clattered to the floor, and Marcus staggered back, his confidence finally shattered. He looked around the room, realizing he was utterly alone. His men had abandoned him, and he was left with nothing but his own rage and humiliation. Ramirez stepped forward, his presence towering. "This is over," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Leave, and don't come back. If I hear your name again, you won't get another chance." For a moment, it seemed like Marcus might try to fight back, but the fire in his eyes was gone. He turned and walked out, his steps heavy with defeat. His crew followed, silent and subdued, leaving the house and disappearing into the night. Maria exhaled, the weight of the moment settling over her. But just as the tension seemed to dissipate, Ramirez turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You did good," he said, his tone softening. "But there's something you need to know." Maria frowned, the unease creeping back in. "What is it?" she asked. Ramirez glanced at Naomi, who gave a small nod. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "The attack that killed our team, it wasn't random." The words hit her like a blow. She stared at him, her mind racing. "What are you saying?" "There's someone out there," Ramirez said, his voice heavy with regret. "Someone who's been pulling the strings all along. They wanted us gone, Maria. And they won't stop until they finish the job." Maria's breath caught, the weight of his revelation sinking in. She thought the fight was over, but it was clear now that it was only the beginning. As the room fell silent, a single thought burned in her mind. The real enemy was still out there, and they were far more dangerous than Marcus could ever be.